Good afternoon. I have to start with some corrections again. I wrote things down instead of trying to remember them. First, the missions. The Northern Mission is not in Santa Rosa, as I stated last week. It is in the little village of Sonoma, which I should know since I go there quite often visiting friends of mine. Nevertheless, I misspoke and called it Santa Rosa, and it should be Sonoma. Secondly, I didn't say anything about a very important feature of California. The early Californians, which were mainly Spaniards and then Mexicans, came into this state and in many instances, particularly under Spain, were given large land grants. And one of them that you should remember is every time you go to LAX, you pass Sepulveda, and that is the name of a very large land grant given to people who came into California when Spain ruled California. So land grants. And then one last subject that I didn't bring up because it took me forever to remember, Grass Valley. My favorite writer about California is not John Steinbeck, as wonderful as he is. My favorite is the guy who taught for some years at Stanford and ran a writing project there. And his name is Wallace Stegner. And his great book is Angle of Repose. And if you want to read a really good book about the early processes of the California people who came to California, do read Stegner's Angle of Repose. It is also true that at Berkeley, we had a person in the music department who took that book, that great novel, and turned it into a perfectly awful opera. His name is Embre. And if you ever hear about the opera, please run in the other direction. So that will take care of those two subjects, I think. And I can now move to the subject of today, which is the critical nature of waterways. Since we live on the West Coast, we should know this, but of course, most Californians know nothing even about California. Why should they know about its waterways? But the subject starts way back. It starts when we were a small little country hanging on the East Coast, very dependent on our waterways to connect us to our home country, which was England, and to connect us to each other. And in those days, our largest city was Philadelphia. And Philadelphia sits on a great river, and it's the river that gives it life. Now, the city that overtook Philadelphia, of course, is New York City. And New York City became a great, great metropolitan center once it was able to make an argument and have a canal dug. And canals were the saviors of many eastern cities. And this, of course, is the Erie Canal, which connected New York City via the Hudson River to the Erie Canal and then to the Great Lakes, so that you could go from Chicago, crossing all the Great Lakes, and come to the Erie Canal and shoot down the Hudson and be in New York. And this then made New York City what it is today, this great metropolitan area that became a hub and surpassed Philadelphia in the years to come. Now, if you can think back to the colonial days when I told you that the biggest city was Philadelphia and its population was only 50,000, Berkeley today has 100,000. So Berkeley is twice as big as colonial Philadelphia. And in that particular period, the states that were formerly colonies had one great strength if they had a series of rivers that led them down to the ocean. And my home state was the leader in that category. It's the state of Virginia, the most populous colony in its day. And a phenomena of Virginia is that it has a huge number of rivers, starting with the James River, named for King James, and the York River, named for the Duke of York, all the way up to the Rappahannock and then the Potomac. Now, these rivers have a unique feature. They have a fall line, and a fall line means you're at a place on the river, usually when there's some white water, a little bit of rapids, and the tide no longer has an impact. So everything that comes downriver from the fall line is called tide water because it's water controlled by the tide. You have a high tide and a low tide in the rivers like James River and York River and Tappahannock or Rappahannock, on and on it goes. So when you had that phenomena, you had control then of traffic and the ability to move. And those who didn't have it wanted to have it. And so they built canals that gave them the same ability that the river gave to those states like South Carolina. There is Charleston, and Charleston is built as a city on a estuary that is controlled by two great rivers. Charleston on the north has a river, and Charleston on the south has a river. And you can go down to Savannah, and there is Savannah, a very famous place because along the Savannah River, when it was possible, nuclear plants were built. And so from Savannah to Charleston to Richmond, Richmond is on the fall line, Richmond, Virginia, of the James River. So everything down from there is tidewater. And then you come to the area of the rolling hills, and then you come to the mountains. And so you have problems when you get to hills and mountains because water doesn't run uphill, it runs downhill. So what you have is people trying to build canals to make it around and to have locks on the canals. And so you can get something like the C&O, the Chesapeake and Ohio, or the Baltimore, Ohio. And these canals also work the same. They are able to lift heavy cargo. And this is what you're interested in, moving large things, large distances, long distances. And if you're able to do that, then you're able to build up your city like Baltimore, or your city like Richmond, or Charleston, or Savannah. And so it went. And many of these canals are still around today. The one that I know best is in Washington, D.C., where I lived for many years. And there you have the old C&O. It's now in the area of Georgetown, which is a very somewhat exclusive and place for a lot of young people to live in strange conditions. Many young people in Georgetown rent actually the slave quarters in old Georgetown that are now very posh and very elegant for a young single person who might be working in the Biden administration. A very nice place to live and a very interesting place because of all the restaurants and the things to do there. So you have your C&O, and there was also a very famous murder there. The murder came of a young blonde woman who was actually associated with the Kennedys. And it was never really a solved mystery as to who killed her. But there was a lot of speculation, as there always was, with the Kennedy, the Irish mafia from Boston. So we think about that in a sort of strange way because when we moved west with Jefferson's famous buyout of the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of our nation, we now had the famous Mississippi River. And rivers are even better than the canals that have to connect to shorter distances. And nevertheless, the Mississippi got a big push when in fact those very smart people who lived in Chicago, which is a great city, and which were connected now to New York via the Erie Canal system and then the Great Lakes. Now we're able to engineer a famous feature of Chicago life. Chicago has a river, and that river is quite wonderful because it comes through the heart of the city. So when you take which I've done several times, a trip on that river, you don't know that that river was reversed. That is, in the old days, the Chicago River ran down to Lake Michigan. And today it runs in the opposite direction and connects Chicago to, lo and behold, the Mississippi River. All this is done by the great engineering features of American ingenuity in putting these things together. So you have not only the buildup in that area, you had people thinking what to do about two other great rivers that connect to the Mississippi. One, of course, is the Ohio River, and the other is the Missouri. And both of them are great waterways for moving goods. Now, initially, the goods were moved by rafts, big rafts that were built, and goods were taken down to New Orleans. And then you had the problem of the raft. So you sold the raft for timber, and you got a mule or some kind of horse and went back to wherever it was you came from, let's say St. Louis or even higher on the Mississippi. Then, of course, Robert Fulton comes along and he says, I'm going to build a steamboat that'll get you up and down river. You don't have to worry about which way the river flows. And so you get the steamboats first on the Hudson, and then later, if you know the old musical Hello, Dolly, you know that there is a steamboat involved in that musical. And if you know the great book and then the great, great musical by Jerome Kern, which is Showboat, there you have a steamboat that's coming down the Mississippi, but can also go up the Mississippi because it's harnessing the forces of steam to drive the paddle wheel that pushes the river boat in the direction where you want it to go. Now, as far as doing that, you could do it, and they did do it on the Ohio. So you could come up and down the Ohio, which I've also done, as well as going up and down the Mississippi on a steamboat, which I've also done. But on the other great river that flows down through the land where you saw a film, Nebraska, a really great film. And by the way, I wish to stop my lecture for a moment to tell Louis Wilde, who is furious that the film that he wanted to see last night, which is also as good as Nebraska was good, will definitely play tonight, hell or high water. It's going to be on tonight, Louis. It is a wonderful film. It's controversial in its own way, but it was recommended very highly. I always worry about these films that get chosen and get put up. So in this case, when this one was nominated, I sent it to two women whose voices I know are loud and clear. One is Renata Coombs, and the other person is not Ruth Campbell, but Ruth Ann Taylor. And both of them reviewed the film and came back and said they highly recommended that it be shown to the community. So I hope you will enjoy it tonight, even though you had to miss it last night due to an admin error. Anyway, back to the Missouri River. The Missouri River is a troublesome river because it, like the Mississippi, can flood. But the Missouri seems to flood all the time. Mississippi only once in a great while, and then it's really terrible. So we had a lot of effort by the Corps of Engineers to put up dams and flood control projects on the Missouri. And then you get, of course, to California and the water here. Now, California is the oddest state of all because typical of all the odd things we are, we're also a hydraulic civilization. Hydraulic civilizations are in places where water has to be moved, like in ancient Egypt when the pharaohs ruled, like now when Gavin Newsom governs. We have to move a hell of a lot of water. And we have to get that water from wet places to dry places. And so we do that with a number of techniques. The most controversial, of course, is to take, say, a river like the Sacramento River, which meets the American River and then comes down to the bay. Before it comes down to the bay, great amounts of water, to include in the old days the destruction of great amounts of fish, are sent south. That's the controversy of northern water, our water, going to Southern California where it's very dry. And we do that constantly now in the sense of making the river pay its way. And the idea of doing this is very, very upsetting to Northerners who might have a shortage of water, while the Southerners who have a real shortage of water are getting our water. But nevertheless, we ship northern water south. And how we do that is we think about it. It's good that we do because we're getting dumber and dumber as the time goes on. I don't want to shock you, but I will. The University of California at Berkeley, having many problems, in recent time canceled the geography department at Berkeley. This was a blow to me because I used a woman geographer there to do all the maps in my books, and she did wonderful maps. And now her department is gone. Not a wise idea for a group of people like Californians who know little about geography to begin with, and now they're losing the department that teaches geography at Cal, their premier university. Nevertheless, we still have to live with the fact. Now, if you go with me in the future, one of these days after we get our second shot and when this damnable virus is gone with the wind, we will be able to travel again. And I want to take a group, starting with my film group, but then anyone else who'd like to join us on the big van, and go over to Sausalito, not to see pictures and do nice little things like that, but to grow to the most brilliant hydraulic model that was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on the same location where the great shipbuilding industry from those days in Sausalito, and that's the Bechtel shipyard. They took over the huge administration building, and inside they built a miniature version of a hydraulic model of the entire bay area and the river system that feeds into the bay. So you can stand there and actually see the movement. You can see them change the tides rapidly from high tide to low tide in 2 minutes. And you can walk the model so you can tell the difference as the water, which is salt water, which is brought in from the bay, stored in one end of the model, and then is released in just like it is in nature when the tides turn and water is coming under the Golden Gate Bridge coming in, or when it's going out. And so by using this model, the Corps was able, they built 3 of these, by the way, one for the Chesapeake Bay area to model the area where the water is rapidly flowing and is very important for the area's seafood industry, which is very big in the Tidewater area of Virginia, where I grew up. And then we built one in the Mississippi Delta area to be able to control the flow and hopefully predict what will happen as too much water comes down and you have a flood that we recently had under Bush Jr. when he was president. And it's very deadly for poor old New Orleans, which had two of its major areas underwater, not the French Quarter nor the Garden District, but the areas out closer on the bay, on the river system itself. So it is that we have this system here in California because we were given the Corps of Engineers as a gift, again, by our great president, Mr. Thomas Jefferson, who created the Corps of Engineers as part of the US Army. In fact, how little we were in those days, I'll show you by another fact. Our Army in Jefferson's day had 50 people in it. Most of them were either teaching at West Point or guarding Fort Pitt, which was then under control and watchful eye of the British, or serving in the Army. So we were pipsqueaks. Anybody could have overrun us. If the Indians had got their act together, we'd been pushed back out into the Atlantic. You remember I told you the country was never empty. It was full of people. They were just not us. And so it was that we got the Corps of Engineers as this wonderful group because Jefferson gave them a mission. They were to scout the areas. They were to go to the ports that needed draining, that needed dredging, and all the other things that the engineers could do. So that a port like Baltimore, which is an ocean-going port, ports like Philadelphia, which is a huge ocean-going port, ports like New York, ports like Boston, and all the miniature ports in between could in fact be improved and made into a better place for navigation and for people to live and for commerce to grow. And so it was that Jefferson started this, and it's going on this very day. The Corps of Engineers has a huge building in downtown San Francisco from which it constantly watches over things. And it particularly watches over the flow of water. It watches over the nature of the water that is coming down into the bay. You probably don't know it, but there's lots of flotsam that comes down. Flotsam that usually has been in the water so long it's underwater now, but 1 foot underwater, and so it can run into and cause trouble for navigation. Huge tankers come in to San Francisco Bay, and they work their way up the bay and then dock near Port Richmond and then offload their cargo there. There's a big offload point. It doesn't look big to you because it's just a system that takes the oil and takes it off the ship and puts it in those huge cylinder storage tanks that you see on the hills when you're crossing over to Marin County from the East Bay. So these areas are very, very important for the nature of both California society, the California that wants to grow and use its water resources. Now we do that in different ways and not just on the Bay Area. Those of you who know something about Los Angeles knows that there was a river in downtown LA. It's all dried up now, but you can go there. The basin is covered in concrete and you can stand by and see where the water used to be. But water is so scarce. By the way, we're due a very large storm coming in tomorrow, and that will give us a lot of rain, but not enough rain. So what you do when you go with me to this model in Sausalito, the old Bechtel headquarters that has the model in it, is that you see that California by nature has a certain feature. You have the ring of the Sierra Nevada, the wonderful mountains that we like to go to and ski. But better than the skiing is the fact that the snow melt will come down slowly but surely, be captured in various casement areas or in certain dams, and being held back for the dry season. So it is that it's from the high mountains, which will hopefully get a lot of snow this storm tomorrow and can never get too much. And then you find the storm water as melting snow coming down to the caption areas, casement areas, or to large dammed rivers where it's held for release in the dry season. And it's been very successful that way, be it here, particularly in the north, but also in the middle part of the state, and for what they can get in the south. There are ski places in Southern California, hard as that is to believe. So this is a process that we work heavily with, and it's not just for your drinking water. There was a big article in the New York Times, also reprinted in the Chronicle, about the fact that with global warming, you remember that feature of current life, there is a critical process called the fisheries of our nation. And apparently several salmon groups are likely to go out of existence. And that will not be good for the salmon and won't be good for us. Now, several of our governors, both named, by the way, Brown, both excellent governors. One is the governor in the state north of us known as Oregon, and the governor in our state, olden days, not the one now, but Governor Jerry Brown. They came together and said they had to work on this issue of the fish in a very big way. And so there were 7 small to medium dams on a river that starts in Northern California and goes into Oregon and then goes out to sea. And with the 7 dams on it, the poor fish didn't have a chance. So what to do? Well, the what to do was to knock down the damn dams. And they agreed to do that. Now, several people were opposed to it. For some strange reason, Dianne Feinstein, better known as Di-Fi, our senator from this state, now the other one has gone off to be vice president, so we have now a wonderful new appointment, but we'll stick with Dianne Feinstein. She has always been tied in with the big water people and the big agriculture people. So she was opposed to this deal, and the 2 governors paid no attention to her at all, and they went ahead and knocked down the dams. Now, the people who lived along the rivers that were dammed were a little unhappy because suddenly they didn't have a dammed pond in front of them. They had a river, and the river fell back further than they had expected. And so they had to think about their new conditions because the fish were free at last, as Martin Luther King would say, and they are making their way up and down the river system so that they can spawn and they can reach the sea so that there will be fresh salmon, one of my favorite foods, not frozen, but fresh salmon coming up and down that one particular river. Elsewhere in California and on the other 2 states that we are sharing the West Coast with, you do also have huge dams. I'm not talking about a little Culver Dam. I'm talking about something in the order of the Hoover and the Grand Coulee. And in these dams, we have huge spillways, but we also have step ladders. These are fish ladders that allow the fish to go up and, of course, allow them to come down. You jump from one part of the ladder to the next. Somehow these salmon are really good at jumping down and going up to make babies and coming down with their babies. Now, in some cases, the areas where the salmon eggs were laid are picked up and placed in breeding ponds, not for more breeding to go on, but for the hatchlings to hatch and for the groups that are watching over them to see to it that they do make it to the sea, given that there are a lot of things along the way that like to eat little salmon. And we don't want them eaten until they're big salmon. And so what you're talking about is water, and the water that is important to California is important in many ways. Let us say we get another hot season like the ones we've been having, and we need extra power to keep our air conditioners. You know, if you go to Sacramento and you go in the summertime, it's really, really hot. And the way to avoid that heat, there's two ways. You can go up to Chico and jump in the river and come down the Sacramento in an inner tube. I have a friend who invited me to do that. In fact, there were 4 or 5 of us, and we went tubing from Chico all the way down to Sacramento itself. But that doesn't help people on the area of getting electricity. So in that particular case, the big dams in the north are great helps to us because they will increase the amount of electricity they send in our direction so that the air conditioning, so you don't, I mean, not everybody can go tubing in Chico in the Sacramento River, and not everybody wants to do that. But I wanted to do it, and we had a wonderful time. Splashing around the river is ice cold. So there you are in a cold, cold river, your own air conditioning, and the outside temperature is very, very hot. So we ended up with a sunburn, but believe me, it was worth it, given the nature of the area. This lady was a graduate of Chico. Her name is Laura. She's a wonderful lady. And she set this up for us, tubes and all. And if you want to do it someday, it's very easy to do. You can bring your own tube or you can rent tubes. And then you can float down the Sacramento River, which itself is very much a basin holding back water. That basin, of course, is way north of Redding. It's a huge lake. And that is also held in reserve. And not only do we do that, but we're very clever people in California, some of us anyway. And you can go up into the hills above Redding, and there's a town called Whiskey Town. And near Whiskey Town, we've been very innovative. We have taken the water that falls. You have to understand that in the rainy season, a lot of water falls from the sky and falls on that slope that leads down to Redding. Now, our engineers have found a way to trap that water, which is just runoff, and to send it down into areas that it can be stored. And then from those storage areas, it can be fed into the Sacramento River at the right time when the Sacramento River, which is already being drained of its water so that it can be shipped south. Now the Sacramento River is being fed water at the right time, water that's coming out of these major storage areas above Whiskey Town, that areas that were filled by rainwater in the rainy season is now being released in the dry season. So all these innovations, whether it's from the Great Lake that's above Redding, which is storing lots of water, and which is also a playground for people who want to take, I don't know if you're interested in ways to do things for vacation, but you can rent houseboats on this wonderful lake and piddle around. because the lake is huge. It's not what a lot of little tiny lake. We're talking a big, big lake full of water. And you can see as the water goes down, the water marks are left along the side of the lake so that you can see where it was at high lake time and where it is on the lower, in hopes of a storm like the one we're going to get tonight and tomorrow, coming and filling it back up, constantly moving our water around. California, which is a hydraulic civilization, living off snowmelt coming out of the Sierras, living off the trapping of river water, living off the damming of some parts of the rivers. All those things can be done in an ingenious way so that you have the water that you need. And sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't. Right now, the announcements have been that we haven't had enough snow and we haven't had enough trapped water, that we will again have a season that's short. And that requires all of us to save water, to make sure that we don't waste water, to make sure that you don't find yourself watering grass. That's one of the nature's problems. We have a huge amount of water that gets wasted by our neighboring state, not coastal, but people like to move to the desert. Why, I don't know, but they do. And they get into desert towns and cities, and they're Easterners, so they love to have grass. Well, grass doesn't grow in the desert. Well, it does if you water it. And so we have the great rivers of the West that don't come to California, like the Colorado. And we take water from Colorado River and ship it to us. And so you have, the problem is that the water runs out. In the signing of the famous treaty that we signed with Mexico when we stole from them the Southwest to include California, we said we would make the state both bilingual, and we would make sure that the water from the Colorado River made it all the way to Baja California. Well, we did neither of those. Typical of things we promise, we don't do. So now the Colorado River runs dry before it can get to Baja California and feed its way into the Sea of Cortez, just dry. Because of course, those idiots who live in Nevada are there watering their lawns, which are not the way to live. If you have any sense at all, you know that you get crushed white rock and you use that. If you don't want to use white rock, then you use the redwood chips that are sold in stores. So you don't have to go very far. You can get your redwood chips and put them down, and then you can plant something called desert plants, better known as cacti. And so that you can have a normal looking place, but not one that is running up against nature. And we are just as bad because we take a huge amount of water out of the Colorado, bring it over, and you can see this system that we have built. It's not a small system. If you drive down to Los Angeles and you come to the Grapevine, you see huge, huge turbines pushing water that's coming from California's north, El Norte, and going south to the dry parts. Now, nobody wants to make people in Southern California thirst to death, but there is a certain amount that can be done to harness what water we have. And particularly in bad years, we're bound to sooner or later, just by sheer luck, get a good year for water. And then we will be dancing in the street. But we are going to have lots of bad years too, and particularly of the population, which is now apparently decreasing. If you can believe it, people are leaving San Francisco itself and the Bay Area itself, going where they think there is less problems instead of more problems. Problems with the homeless, problems with the weather, problems left and right. So it is that we will try, I hope, to find a way around these issues that are very, very big. Saving the fish, for instance. We've done a great job of knocking down those little dams in the area of Northern California and Southern Oregon to let the fish make it to the sea. In the other bigger dams, we are helping the fish get up and down their ladders. And then we're saving the little babies to make sure that they're not eaten. You know, there are a lot of things that eat baby salmon. They don't wait for them to grow big and juicy the way I like them. And so you have to get these babies, take them, let them grow into fingerlings, then take the whole group of fingerlings in big water systems all the way down to the sea and then release them, giving the baby salmon a chance to do its thing and come back in 5 or 6 years to make more babies. It's not that hard to figure out, but it seems to be hard to get done if you have people who are, like Dianne Feinstein, selling their soul to big agriculture. Obviously, California wants to have these big agri businesses, but we don't grow the right crops in many places because we're so dependent on getting the water for free. So what do you have? You have cotton being grown in California. Cotton does not grow in California. Cotton grows in the South. It was called King Cotton there. All you have to do is look at the land in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and see cottonland. You don't have to grow it in California. And it's water intensive. So let it be planted in areas that have lots of water and let it get the hell out of the way of California. And that's not the only one. I have some very good friends who also, like me, have retired from Berkeley. And he's Hungarian. And he loves to shoot. And he loves to shoot those little birds that are so pretty that it seems like a sin to kill them, but boy, are they tasty. And maybe you know what they are. And he, therefore, bought himself a huge stretch of land. I've gone up on it, and it's wonderful to stay there in the trailers that they have and spend the night and to eat pheasant. God, is it good when it's fresh. The problem is he likes to get those pheasants nice and fat. So on his land, he lets a local farmer grow tons of rice. And the rice, of course, attracts the pheasants. They love rice. It makes them nice and fat and juicy. And so how you have is the best conditions for pheasant hunting, but not for agriculture. We should not plant rice in California. It's water intensive. For God's sakes, wake up and smell the roses. It's time to forbid certain crops. All those crops, and I hate to tell those people who live way down south in Southern California that all those groves you have of almonds and other nuts are also water intensive. And if necessary, you can get pistachios. You know where to get them? They grow like wild in Iran. Why don't we start trading things with Iran instead of threatening to blowing them up? Why don't we do the right things, Mr. Biden, and not the wrong things? We need to move against these kinds of issues on a national and state and local level. We do not need to grow rice and cotton in California, period. We do not need to grow pistachios in Southern California. I don't care how much they love them down there in Palm Springs. Palm Springs only exists because it can get some water from us in the north, so they can give up on their pistachios and other things, leaving nature to do nature's best and leaving us to think ourselves through on these kinds of issues, because water will always remain a major issue. And the years when we have a small amount of snow covering the mountains and the Sierras, we're going to get that small amount of water trickling down from all those streams and rivers that make up our hydraulic system. We are a hydraulic civilization. We have to live with that knowledge, and we have to make that knowledge work for us. And we don't do that by canceling geography as a subject matter to be studied at Berkeley. We need to get some more Berkeley students who know a little something about nature itself. It's very fine to know a lot about French literature, but that's not going to bring you any water. And water is the lifeblood of the state, and our waterways are very, very important to us. So whether it was the canals of the East Coast, whether it was the building of the Erie Canal, one of the great features that makes New York City, whether it was turning the Chicago River around so it runs in the other direction so Chicago can go either down the Mississippi or around down the Great Lakes too, and through the Erie Canal and the Hudson River. Making waterways work is a major feature of life in America. And it's a feature we should make very great attention to, because without it, we're in a hard spot to try and make things work. We are and will always be, on good years and bad years, a hydraulic civilization. I hope I can explain that to you visually when we make our trip once this next week, I guess it is, I get my second shot. And I hope all of you are taking those shots. And then we can maybe get out of this place, out of our little local prison, and go visiting. And we should go over to Sausalito and see this hydraulic model, see ourselves, see exactly where Piedmont Garden is on this model, see how important water is even over here in Oakland, and see how we can make these things work. And by doing so, making California stay green, but not the way Nevada stays green. Nevada needs to have a lot of white rock and not that a lot of redwood chips. And they need to stop taking water that's vital and necessary to a state that's near them, and to a promise we made to the Mexican people, none of which we've ever kept, but we could try for a change. Some of you could learn Spanish for a change. Some of you could make sure that the Rio River, not just the Rio Grande, but the Colorado River in the west, flows all the way to Baja, so that it receives its share of the water, the share that we are draining away because we're so desperate, so totally desperate for water. And we can win, and we can make it work. It just needs a little thinking, something we've not been all that good about in the past, but we need to be good about in the future, assuming there is a future. And we need people like Gavin Newsom, our current governor, who hasn't been very good in the past on these issues, but could stop listening to Dianne Feinstein, who sold her soul to big agriculture. Big agriculture is not the answer. It's one of the things if it's the right kind of agriculture. And it's not one of the things if it's the wrong kind. And I want to tell you, I've told you 100 times so far, I'll tell you 100 more. Cotton doesn't grow in California. It's water intensive. We don't need it. It grows like crazy in the land of King Cotton, and they have more than enough. We don't need any of California's cotton, and we don't need any of California's rice. What we need is a sensible policy about what water we have and how we're going to use it in the future. And we can do that. If you can make a river turn around and run the other way, if you can connect the Erie Canal so that it connects the greatest city in America, New York City, up the Hudson to the Great Lakes, through Chicago, down the Mississippi, you have a marvelous sense of the use and not the abuse of nature and nature's fondness in the form of the water it gives us. It falls from the heavens. And like many things, it is one of the benefits of living in California, although somehow people have decided it's no longer the Golden State and they're leaving. And so I wish them well. We do have too many people there anyway. All you have to do is try and go out on a freeway and you wonder where the hell all these people came from. Well, they're around us, they've surrounded us, and they're using our water. And it's a particularly big issue now as to what to do about the diversion of the American and Sacramento rivers. When that river hits that certain point, it's combined together, it's come down. It's a real problem as it goes shooting off down south instead of continuing to flow. Now, its flow is very important. You might not know this, but in the days when we misbehaved, which was almost all the days we were here, we found gold. Hooray for us. And in gold mining, we used some really poisonous stuff that doesn't disappear. You've heard of arsenic? Well, it's not good for your health. And this arsenic and other heavy pollutants were used in the gold mining business by the gold miners. And it went down the river, of course, and it went into the river's sandy bottom. So now we're stuck with a huge amount of poison. And so the Corps of Engineers have come to our rescue again. They go down with big shovels and floating barges, and they take all of that crap that we put in the soil, into the sand, into the bay, into the river, and they scoop it up. And then they take it north. They used to take it out to the Farallon Islands and dump it there. But even the great white sharks didn't want it in their territory. So now it's generally scooped up, put on the barge, and taken north to an area that we have ruined and we're trying to restore. At the mouth of the Napa River, you know Napa, well, there's a huge amount of tideland, and they dump it there. They dump this sandy bottom stuff they've scooped up, and they're forming again a big green belt, because once they dump it, then they plant on top of it. And this planting has helped hold the soil and hold back this pollutant. And this is really very wonderful and also very dangerous for us, because in the runoff, you have a major problem, man-made, California-made, dummy California-made, and you're trying to correct it now. And you're doing, the Corps again is doing a good job. The Corps is also trying to figure out how to keep, of course, little mining going on now, and what goes on, you don't use arsenic. But you are trying, in your many ways, to find some way to clean up. Let me tell you a story. They don't come to us anymore. They're fed up with us. That's the United States Navy. But the Navy used to come into Alameda. That's what Alameda is, a big Navy station was. And even then, there were difficulties. The Navy carriers, like the Nimitz, which doesn't come to us anymore, comes to San Diego, which has problems of its own. But these carriers couldn't get through and get under the Bay Bridge when it was heavy with traffic, because the Bay Bridge goes down 100 feet. It comes down 100 feet, and therefore we'd be taking out the Bay Bridge if we did what is doable. So the Navy made it their policy to go under the Bay Bridge at the stroke of 2 o'clock in the morning, when there is no traffic to speak of on the Bay Bridge, and then get over to Alameda and dock. So it was a problem for a long time. Now it isn't that kind of problem, because the Navy said, kiss off San Francisco. It's such an anti-military town. We'll take our business elsewhere. And they did. And we lost everything. We even lost the idea of having the USS Missouri docked permanently in San Francisco. The Navy doesn't like us, and that's it. Now, this is something you can test to see what it is that's odd about us and the Bay. The Bay is only 1/3 of what it is now, 2/3 of what it used to be. It's lost 1/3 of itself. How did it lose 1/3 of itself? Well, because the wonderful cities, the wonderful liberal California cities like Berkeley, used to dump their garbage at the end of University Boulevard. And that became landfill. And so 1/3 of the Bay has disappeared for landfill, for garbage. How wonderful. And there's no way to get it back. It's also one of the phenomena, if you go down to San Mateo Bridge, and as you drive across from our end to the peninsula end, you say, oh my God, there's somebody walking on water. This hasn't happened since Jesus walked on water. How is it that they're able to walk on water in the South Bay? A lot of Jesus people must be down here. No, my friends, it has nothing to do with the Nazareth. It has to do with the fact that the bay is very, very shallow. And the South Bay is less than 5 feet deep. So obviously you can go out there and you can hunt for mussels or any other kind of seafood, or just walk around. You can see it. There it is. A very shallow bay, less than 5 feet deep. And you always thought it was maybe 100 feet deep. If you want deep, go and jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. You're really deep there. You won't be seen again until they find you out near the Farallones, having met your maker. But in most of the Bay Area, it's 5 feet or less. You can walk on water, do your little thing. Now, many people around the Bay Area know this. And of course, I hate to say this because it's a coup for Palo Alto. People in Palo Alto have been very, very proud of their tidelands and have always been opposed to filling in any of that. And they've made a little park out of their tidelands. And they go walking out into the parkland so that the park is is on stilts. So the water is running all around and underneath the stilted area. But you can, and boy, I want to tell you, there's some little old ladies from Palo Alto. And if you'd even talk about doing anything, they'd beat you to death with their broomsticks or whatever, but they would not allow you to touch an inch of the tidelands in front of Palo Alto. And they're very proud of them. They go down there to them. They walk on the things that have been built, the pilings that have been put down so that they can build these little walkways. And they're very proud of it, and proud they should be. But I've beaten the subject to death, and I now see that it's time for me to let you know that we're running out of time. We're trying to let you know, particularly my friend Louie, that movie is going to show tonight come hell or high water. So if you wanted to see it, tune in at 7 o'clock. And if you don't see it, wait 5 minutes and then you'll hear an explosion. It'll be me, because that film is going to show, again, come hell or high water. Thank you for listening, and come back next week. We'll have another subject for you.